everyone. Welcome to a new episode of Bolt Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. This week kind of serves as a breaking news, element to this week's show. Although we knew about this last week, the Chargers have made it official today. There are new changes on the coaching staff. So obviously, we heard last week from Tom Pelissero, who had the original report that Ronaldo Hill was going to leave to Miami to work with Vic Fangio. Did take a demotion in the process, so, however you want to phrase it, it seemed like a bit of a quiet firing. We did hear about the Chargers interviewing candidates for that defensive coordinator position, but it seemed like the original expectation the whole time was that Derrick Ansley, previous secondaries coach, was going to be promoted to defensive coordinator, and that is indeed what happened today, with Derrick Ansley being promoted to defensive coordinator. Tom Donatel being promoted, I believe, from assistant secondaries coach to passing game coordinator / secondaries coach as well, replacing Derrick Ansley, who received this promotion to defensive coordinator. And we did have two other hires that we knew about made official. Doug Nussmeier officially becomes the quarterbacks coach on Kellen Moore's offensive staff, and Jeff Howard comes over from Cleveland and becomes the official linebackers coach after being the pass game coordinator for Cleveland last year. So very interesting all around. I guess we should talk about Derrick Ansley first, who was obviously the secondaries coach, very well-liked guy in the secondary as a whole. Derwin James put out a public, approval, I guess, of the hire today, even though it's clear that both of them knew that this was going to happen a couple days ago. But still, very interesting to see him promoted to defensive coordinator, and he seemed to be very hands-on with the secondary anyway. Obviously, we saw the development of Michael Davis. We've seen the development of a lot of key players in the secondary, and obviously, is a key figure with Derwin James as well. And you saw the public approval from Derwin today, like I said. And overall, their pass defense really finished strong over the last stretch of the season. Their secondary was playing really well, despite all of the injuries they had kind of managed throughout the season. So Derrick Ansley, prior to joining the Chargers and being the secondaries coach, he was, of course, in college, right? Spent 2 seasons as the defensive coordinator and defensive backs coach at the University of Tennessee, and then worked under Nick Saban as well, as working with the defensive backs in the Alabama Crimson Tide room as well. So, he has a lot of college experience and a lot of pro experience with the Chargers that he now brings to the table in taking over this role. I think the question that a lot of people will have about the Derrick Ansley hire / Ronaldo Hill firing is, in a sense, how much does the defensive coordinator do, right? Brandon Staley still implicitly is the defensive coordinator, right? He is the defensive play caller, right? The buck kind of stops with him, but you kind of wonder that if Derrick Ansley is promoted to defensive coordinator and, with not knowing exactly what Ronaldo Hill's job was anyway, if Ansley, even though he won't have play calling duties, will be a little bit more hands-on in the creation of the game plan and in the development of defensive talent in general, and maybe get more of a say, like we've seen with Ryan Ficken with special teams, to some extent Joe Lombardi on offense, of being able to choose some of his, personnel as well. It didn't really seem like Ronaldo Hill was terribly involved in that, for what it's worth. And the Chargers experienced a lot of defensive injuries to the point where they couldn't really choose their personnel last year. But it does seem like Derrick Ansley, even though he won't have play calling duties, will be a little bit more hands-on given his experience in coaching the Chargers secondary and receiving this promotion. Of course, as we talked about, Tom Donatel promoted now to the secondary coach position, replacing Derrick Ansley as he's promoted to the defensive coordinator position. So overall, a lot of positive things have been said about Tom Donatel, and as Tom Pelissero put in his original report, which I'll put on the screen now, one of the reasons that the Chargers kind of made this move and moving on from Ronaldo Hill, although it seems like it was a quiet firing, was to promote Derrick Ansley to the defensive coordinator role and promote Tommy Donatel as well. A lot of other coaches are building their staffs right now. as we're seeing around the league. And overall, it seemed like the Chargers really wanted to put a primer on keeping Derrick Ansley and keeping Tommy Donatel in-house when maybe they would have received promotions elsewhere on some of these, unfinished coaching staffs yet that are still taking shape, right? Still not a lot of offensive coordinators, but still some defensive coordinators for these, new staffs to kind of be fleshed out. Even some, guys who received promotions. For example, the Eagles are looking for a new defensive coordinator. You got a lot of teams around the league who are, just looking to kind of fill these spots. So it seemed like the Chargers wanted to make Derrick Ansley one of their pretty big priorities, as well as Tommy Donatel. And in talking about Donatel and sort of his move up, he is again advancing, kind of getting promoted, and has been, credited with a lot of the development. Much like Ansley, they two worked hand in hand. And like Ansley, I think it's interesting that both of them do have college experience in particular. You do have Donatel, who's a former college linebacker, then turned safety, was a graduate assistant at USF, then went to UCLA, and then spent 4 seasons with the Seahawks in a defensive or in a quality control defense capacity. And then overall, you've just seen Tommy Donatel kind of climb the ladder before he then joined Staley's staff. And then, overall, he's just kind of worked his way up the totem pole to the secondary position now. Talking about some of these other moves that have been made, we do have Jeff Howard, who I think is one of the weirder signings, right? Not that he's a weird signing, but overall, Jeff Howard was not previously a linebackers coach in the league, right? In terms of his last position, he was the passing coordinator, defensive backs coach for the Cleveland Browns. Now is replacing Michael Wilhoit, who, surprisingly, we never really got a question or answer from Telesco or Staley as to why he was fired or why they felt those, failings made it incapable of him to move forward. I don't know. And, Cleveland secondary was not great this year, but here comes Chargers media coming within. Howard secondary helped Cleveland ranked tied for second in the NFL with 11 total red zone takeaways, tying for most by any AFC team as the unit finished 5th in the league in passing defense each of the last 2 seasons. Of course, we have to extend it to the last 2 seasons and not talk about this season separately. But, that's what Chargers media is going to do, I suppose. So we'll see how Jeff Howard plays out. I think that this is a hiring that a lot of Chargers Twitter has not been in love with, for what it's worth. And I do think it's kind of questionable, but Howard ultimately seems to kind of been a Staley guy. It seems like they had a previous relationship, kind of elsewhere. And I do believe was related to, why Staley originally brought Ryan Ficken in as special teams coordinator. So maybe there's something that he does see with Howard in this capacity now as the team's linebackers coach. And the Chargers are going to have a lot of problems to work through in the linebacker room. We'll see if Drew Tranquill comes back. But the Chargers do face a possibility of having to kind of rebuild that room. Kenneth Murray going into his last year, probably on his contract after the Chargers turned down the 5th-year option as potentially a linebacker 1 if they don't re-sign Drew Tranquill at that $7 million per year value. A lot of that is still TBD. So Jeff Howard is going to be a pretty crucial signing for the Chargers in this moment. And then kind of going forward here, we do have Muschamp, who is coming over from Georgia. That is Robert Muschamp, who is coming in as the defensive quality control coordinator, so to speak. And, obviously, Staley loves his Georgia guys. We've seen that time and time again. And now he gets a chance to get promoted, whereas that opportunity didn't really exist so much at Georgia. Was a graduate assistant in Tennessee, then, worked with Georgia these last 2 years in particular, now gets a bit of a promotion here to the pros to kind of see what he can do. So I think it's an interesting signing. I know some people want to tie this to some certain Georgia players who are in the draft, particularly Georgia defensive players. I wouldn't go that far yet, right? This is one, signing for a quality control coach. This is not necessarily a defensive coordinator signing, but We know that Staley has had a lot of, love for Georgia and how they've been run. And, there have already been kind of connections there with previous Staley signings and draft picks and such. So, it doesn't necessarily surprise me to see Muschamp here in this capacity. And then Doug Nussmeier. We know about Doug Nussmeier, I guess, for about 2-3 weeks now. After Kellen Moore was hired, we waited for that quarterback's coach hire. Didn't feel like we were getting one for a while. And then Kellen Moore gets his guy in Nussmeier, who worked obviously very close with both Kellen Moore and Dak Prescott in Dallas. And overall, Nussmeier obviously did a lot of great work with Dak Prescott, particularly in 2021. And then, Dak did have a bit of an up and down year this year, but Nussmeier kind of made it work with whoever was out there. The Cowboys have started a lot of quarterbacks in previous seasons, from Ben DiNucci to Cooper Rush to, you name it. Both in the years that they had to, when Dak Prescott was injured, with COVID regulations and such, they've had to start a lot of quarterbacks, and they've been successful. This maybe makes the Chargers a little bit interested in a guy like Cooper Rush, potentially for quarterback 2. Might be a little too expensive, but we'll see. Obviously, there is a connection now to both Kellen Moore and Doug Nussmeier as quarterback's coach. And so, we'll kind of have to see how this plays out. But, the Chargers felt like it was very important to have their offensive coordinator and their quarterback's coach on the same page. And they've certainly done that with Kellen Moore and Doug Nussmeier. We already talked a little bit about Tommy Donatel. That is kind of the Chargers coaching staff stuff. I did want to briefly, talk about some of the Ronaldo Hill stuff in particular. First, I guess I should say this. In terms of the process of how this, promotion went with Derrick Ansley, it was a bit weird last week, right? Because we saw that the Chargers were projected to promote Derrick Ansley to the defensive coordinator position when it was first reported by Pelissero, but then the day later we saw that the Chargers, for their vacant defensive coordinator position, also interviewed Patriots defensive line coach DeMarcus Covington and University of Houston defensive coordinator Doug Belk. And Covington also interviewed with the Arizona Cardinals for their previously open position, I should say. And so, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens here. Not so much with these interviews anymore, but just looking at the kind of guys that they did interview. Yeah, this was a Rooney Rule obligation that they did have to fulfill with DeMarcus Covington. But looking at these interviews on a whole, I remember we talked to Daniel Popper when the Chargers were doing their offensive coordinator interviews. And when they did their offensive coordinator interviews, we talked about some of the guys that probably weren't going to get the job, but were on the Chargers schedule next year. And that's kind of why they interviewed them, to get some information. So even though the Chargers probably knew that they were promoting Derrick Ansley anyway, they go ahead and talk to DeMarcus Covington, who's a 2023 opponent of the Chargers, the New England Patriots, on I believe a road game in Foxborough. So worth pointing that out. They give Doug Belk an interview too in this process for the defensive coordinator job. So maybe that's something for down the road, guys that the Chargers can talk to if they ever have kind of staff issues in the future, with this connection that's already been made there. But do think it's pretty interesting that they are playing the Patriots next year, much in the vein of what Popper talked about in the GAC crossover episode, and sort of how Tom Telesco's conducted interviews in the past. But that's about it for today's episode, guys. Thank you for listening to me talk about these Chargers coaching hires. Let me know what you think about Derrick Ansley being promoted to defensive coordinator, Tommy Donatel being promoted to secondaries coach, as well as Jeff Howard being promoted to linebackers coach, and Doug Nussmeier being promoted to quarterbacks coach, down in the comments below. Do you like these firings? Or do you like these firings? You give your thoughts on Ronaldo Hill. I meant to say, do you like these hirings? You can let me know in the comments down below, as always, and bolt up.